Welcome everybody to this latest Canary Live. My name is Pablo Navarrete, and on behalf of the Canary, I welcome you this evening. I know that you should be joining us either on one of the Canary's social media channels, the YouTube, Facebook or Twitter, but also we are going live on a number of other Facebook pages, such as Hands Off Venezuela, Alborada, Venezuelanalysis, Telesur English, and a number of others. So however you're joining us, welcome. We're delighted that you could join us for this, what promises to be a really informative talk on the UK government's attempts to essentially overthrow the Venezuelan government, support the US government's ongoing coup attempts in Venezuela. Joining us this evening, we have Rachael Boothroyd, who is a journalist who lived in Venezuela for more than 6 years. In fact, me and Rachael have worked together. Most recently in 2019, we traveled to Venezuela to make two 15-minute documentaries, The Other Venezuela and Defending the Revolution. You can look at, you can watch these on YouTube. They're free to watch on YouTube and Facebook, where we were exploring the current political climate in the aftermath of Juan Guaidó, this Venezuelan opposition person declaring himself president, something that the UK and the US and a number of other Western countries kind of accepted and promoted. So Rachael has been covering Venezuela for a number of years. So have I, through for more than 10 years. Both of us have lots of experience covering Venezuela, and we'll be talking with an excellent journalist, John McEvoy, good friend, who has been at the forefront of exposing, really single-handedly, the UK government's role in this ongoing coup attempt in Venezuela, to the surprise of no one who's been paying attention. His exposés have been met with silence in the British media. Most recently, he exposed, well, I'm not sure if it was the latest one, but one of his last exposés was about a secret unit the British government had created to sort of work the quote-unquote transition in Venezuela. So we're here. We have an hour, or just under an hour now, to talk with John about what he's been exposing, what he's been finding out about Boris Johnson and previous UK prime ministers and governments, the extent of their support for the US regime change agenda in Venezuela. I should say, so this, if you haven't come across the Canary before, the Canary is an independent British media website outfit that has John's articles. In fact, many of them, or most of them, I'd say, have appeared on the Canary, and it's been, at the forefront of sort of showing this kind of hidden story that the mainstream British media doesn't want to cover. So I would urge you to support the Canary. Independent media is needed now more than ever. I myself am also the founder, co-editor of Alborada, a portal on Latin America, in English, and you can check alborada.net if you want to know more. You're welcome to also support that portal. And also supporting this event is Venezuelanalysis, which Rachael is one of the editors of, the editorial collective. They're based in Venezuela, and they are really the best website covering developments in Venezuela from a kind of grassroots perspective. I myself lived in Venezuela in 2005 for a year and a half and contributed 1 or 2 articles to them. But I would urge anyone wanting to know more about Venezuela to check out Venezuelanalysis. So that's we've got about 55 minutes. We're going to be strict with the time. And before we enter into discussion with John and he tells us what he's been finding out, we thought it would be useful for Rachael to provide a kind of a brief overview of US imperialism in Venezuela since 1999, when Hugo Chavez became the president of Venezuela following a landslide election victory. And this is really what transformed Venezuela's relations with the US and the region. And so Rachael's going to kind of give us that context, which I think is going to be really useful to better understand what John's been finding out. So over to you, Rachael.
Great, thanks, Pablo. Thanks for the intro, and thanks to the Canary for allowing us this, space to have this important discussion. Like Pablo said, I'm just going to speak for like 5 to 10 minutes, just to give people a bit of context, really, as to why Venezuela is a target for imperialism. And the first thing that it's important to say is, of course, that Venezuela has absolutely massive oil reserves. So it actually has the largest oil reserves on the planet. And throughout the 20th century, various governments in Venezuela, including 2 dictatorships, had really cozy relationships with the US, often handing out concessions and contracts to foreign oil companies for drilling rights, really like sweets, and often in exchange for not very much. And like Pablo said, this all changed totally with the election of Hugo Chavez's Frias in 1998. And at that point, though, Chavez wasn't talking openly about socialism. He was spouting some really progressive and radical stuff. So, for instance, at this point, he's talking about the tree of 3 roots, as kind of the background to his political thought, and the key to his political project. And these 3 figures of the tree of 3 roots were Ezequiel Zamora, Simon Rodriguez, and Simon Bolivar, who were all really anti-colonial, important historical figures in Venezuela. Of course, Simon Bolivar was who liberated large parts of Latin America from Spanish rule. Also, in spite of the fact that he came from the military, Chavez had really strong links to the organised left and revolutionary movements. And when he came to power in 1999, he was most known, really, and even obviously in his election, for having led a failed coup attempt in 1992 against a repressive government led by Carlos Andrés Pérez. Basically, after it massacred around 3,000 Venezuelans who'd gone out onto the streets to protest a government austerity program in 1989. So that's where Chavez came from politically in the public eye. But his election's really important for a number of points, but also specifically at that time, because throughout the 1990s, we had the whole mantra of Tina, which is, there's no alternative to capitalism or neoliberalism. There's no place for the left anymore. Capitalism's won out. The left has no power, etc. And of course, Chavez arrives and he totally blows this out of the water. So Chavez did a lot of things, but 2 things that he did quite early on, which are really important for understanding why, he's so revered by the US, is that firstly he begins to organize the OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which at this point is pretty defunct. And he basically starts pushing for a cut in production to increase global oil prices. And secondly, he starts to take steps to effectively renationalize Venezuela's oil industry and bring it under the control of the state. And he does this in order to fund a series of social programs in Venezuela known as the misiones, or the missions, broadly in health, education, culture, etc. And these, social programs are unsurprisingly wildly popular. But as you can imagine, this does not go down well with the US and Europe. Chavez is not only an obstacle to their business as usual in Venezuela and oil exploitation there, but he's also the threat of a good example across Latin America and beyond, really. So obviously taking control over your own resources in a country is not an idea that the US wants to catch on. So pretty much since the word go, both the national oligarchy in Venezuela and the US are looking for a way to get rid of Chavez. And this culminates in an incredibly dramatic coup attempt against him in 2002, which is led by the opposition and high-ranking members of the military, and of course given the nod by the US. This coup is really only reversed thanks to the revolutionary action of the Venezuelan people, really, who marched on the presidential palace in their hundreds of thousands, surrounding the opposition until Chavez was eventually brought back, basically before opposition politicians were strung up from the nearest lamppost by the Venezuelan people. So this, this coup or attempted coup, it acts as like a counter-revolutionary whip. And by 2005, 2006, Chavez is really talking openly about socialism as the only way to save the planet and to save humankind. And the Chavista project is really radically challenging capitalist logic and representative democracy, both at home and abroad. So whether that's in Venezuela through the development of its participatory democracy, through communal councils, communes, experiences in workers' control, which are ultimately, if you read kind of like government plans, they're meant to, and discourse at the time as well in popular culture, they're ultimately meant to replace the nation state and capitalist socioeconomic relations. And then internationally, Venezuela's also promoting organizations like the ALBA, which is the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our Americas, which is promising kind of direct trade within Latin America instead of a free trade model, propagated by the US, in which the global South is, historically exploited by the global North. So, by this point at home, you should have caught onto the idea, the US does not like this, not one little bit. And of course, right the way through the 2000s and beyond, the US government, and this is regardless of whether it's a Republican or Democrat government later on with Barack Obama, is funding the Venezuelan opposition with tens of millions of dollars through bodies such as USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy. And this has all been exposed by people like Eva Gollinger, who through Freedom of Information requests. And if you want to find out more, because there's not a lot of time to go into it, then you can head over to Venezuelanalysis, because we have a lot of information on all that, on all the Freedom of Information requests and the funding to the Venezuelan opposition by the US. So unfortunately, Chavez is diagnosed with cancer in 2011, and then unfortunately ultimately passes away in 2013. And this is a huge turning point in Venezuela, because it gives the opposition renewed vigor and energy to finally get rid of Chavismo once and for all, which it's never been able to do at the ballot box. And it's tried, at the ballot box, but also, like I said, through coups, etc., oil lockouts, where they tried to bring the oil industry, national oil industry, to its knees. So after Chavez's death, I'd say the opposition really starts to use violence more frequently and more intensely to fulfill its aims. So between 2013 and 2017, they start to use a form of violence called the guarimbas, or street barricades, on various occasions, most notably in 2014 and 2017. And on these occasions, more than 150 people are killed in this period. Chavistas are targeted by armed opposition protesters. Black Venezuelans who are presumed to be Chavistas by opposition supporters are lynched. Roads are blocked. Whole communities are held to ransom and cut off from gas deliveries. Ambulances are physically stopped from getting through to people who need them. Now, I lived in Venezuela at this time, and a lot of the mainstream media referred to these guarimbas as democracy protests, but they were anything but, and they were incredibly violent and classist. And then, of course, they countered with US support right the way through this, in the public arena, and as well also in funding-wise, particularly the student movement aligned to the US opposition. And then after 2017, we see this kind of street violence morph into more direct attempts to capture the state via force. And in fact, since 2017, we've seen at least 3 attempted coups or armed uprisings in conjunction with a very small number of defected military personnel against the government. And in particularly, most notably in January 2019, when a random opposition legislator called Juan Guaidó declared himself president, and then later tried to stage an ultimately unsuccessful coup on April 30th later that year. And all this goes hand in hand with an escalation from the US and other imperialist countries in their coercive measures against Venezuela, its democracy and its economy, really kicking off in 2015 when President Barack Obama used an executive order to somewhat ludicrously declare Venezuela a threat to US national security and to sanction individuals in the Venezuelan government. Now, even the UN has said that there's no basis for this in international law, and it actually violates international law in terms of the sovereignty of states. since then, Venezuela has gradually become subject to one of the harshest sanction regimes in the world. There's a huge web of sanctions that have been directed at Venezuela over the past few years, led by the US, but not exclusively by them. But just to give you the headlines, in 2017, under Donald Trump, the US basically blocked Venezuela from accessing the international financial market, so it couldn't do things like renegotiate or refinance its debt, hoping to force Venezuela into a debt default. And then again, immediately after recognizing Juan Guaidó as president in January 2019, the US slapped Venezuela with an oil embargo, confiscated a raft of Venezuela's assets, state bank accounts, and even a US-based oil subsidiary of state oil company PDVSA, known as Citgo. At this same time, the US has diverted $40 million in Central American aid to Guaidó and the Venezuelan opposition, as well as millions of dollars in funds from frozen Venezuelan assets in the US. So just to round up, by 2019, Venezuela's economy is basically blacklisted. It really is totally under fire from imperialism. It can't sell its oil, which is the main source of its income. In fact, a report released recently by UN Special Rapporteur Alina Duhan stated that Venezuela is now living off just 1% of its pre-sanctions income, according to government figures. Obviously, with such a huge drop in its revenue and the impossibility of access to US state dollars, both thanks to the sanctions, it can't import necessary things like medicines, spare parts and chemicals for its oil industry. Because of this, there's a knock-on effect there's domestic fuel shortages, for instance, which affect food cultivation and transport. And the humanitarian fallout is absolutely, massive. This can't be understated. 40,000 people are calculated to have died. That was in a report by the CPR, the Centre for Economic Policy Research. But as many people have pointed out, that projection was made before 2019 when the harshest sanctions were imposed. And so the real number of casualties is probably far greater, especially as the country's now dealing with the fallout from COVID, which has been made so much more complicated by these sanctions. So that's kind of like a rundown. It was hard to fit it into such a small amount of time, and there's undoubtedly a lot that I've left out. But I've spoke a lot about the US's role in it all, and I think it'd be good if we could bring John in, because the UK's also, had a really key part in all this, and he's done some really good work in exposing that.
If we could get John in to tell us where Johnson and all his special relationship work comes to.
Yeah, how does the UK figure in all of this, John? What's been their role?
Yeah, cheers for the introduction, Pablo, and thanks for going through the last 2 decades of what's been going on in Venezuela. It's really summed up. I suppose how Venezuela is being punished for everything it's done right over the past couple of decades, rather than whatever instances of what it's done wrong, especially by the US. But of course, the UK is also involved in this process. I'll pick up in 2019 where you left off, when Juan Guaidó kind of magically declared himself president, of course, with the guiding hand of the US and Donald Trump's State Department. Almost immediately after Guaidó declared himself president, of course, the US recognized him. But under clear US pressure, Jeremy Hunt, the UK's foreign secretary, was one of the first, designated England, the UK is one of the first countries to recognize Juan Guaidó after giving President Maduro 8 days to call for fresh elections, as if this was kind of the domain of the UK's responsibility to be able to do this, or to do this at all. And one of the first things that Hunt accused the Maduro government of doing was stuffing ballots in the 2018 election. This shows the kind of ignorance that the UK government possesses with regards to Venezuela's election process, because of course there aren't paper ballots to stuff whatsoever. Since the UK government recognised Guaidó as president of Venezuela, there's been a number of covert and overt ways in which the UK has been involved with trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government. And the key example, I would say at least, was the revelation, which I revealed in the Canary, of a secret Venezuela reconstruction unit held within the British Foreign Office. Now, nothing had ever been published about this unit whatsoever online. It wasn't on any official government documents. The head of the unit, John Saville, who's the former UK ambassador to Venezuela between 2014 and 2017. He had a government profile, but it didn't exist anywhere on it. I mean, his last governmental duties were listed in 2017 when he resigned as ambassador. So the existence of this unit was unveiled by Guaidó. Visited the UK in 2020, and he had a lot of official visits. He visited Boris Johnson at the time, Dominic Raab, then Foreign Secretary. But under the Freedom of Information Act, I found documents that showed that he also met with Saville, who was listed as the head of the Venezuela reconstruction unit. Now this was quite an important revelation because, I mean, first of all, it shocked the Venezuelan government to think that the UK government thought it had the right to reconstruct any country whatsoever. And secondly, if you look at the history of British attempts to reconstruct other countries, it's often in the wake of destroying them. So if you look in the case of Iraq, the reconstruction process of Iraq was effectively privatising its oil industry and offering and divvying it up between British and US corporations. You had a similar situation with the fall of Gaddafi in Libya. Ironically, Alan Duncan, a Foreign Office minister, was involved in secret talks about dividing up Libya's oil interests. He was also very heavily involved with not only the Venezuelan reconstruction unit, but Britain's policy towards Venezuela over the past 2 years as well. And I mean, this is also consistent with private conversations that I obtained of Juan Guaidó's UK ambassador, Vanessa Neumann, who discussed sustaining British business interests in Venezuela in this post-reconstruction era, i.e. a post-hypothetical coup. So the UK is quite explicitly planning for a coup in Venezuela. Not only is it doing so, it's holding secret meetings with the made-up President Juan Guaidó and discussing the reconstruction of Venezuela, which I think we can gain a subtext of that, which is dividing up its most valuable assets. And of course, Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world. And the fallout from this article was quite interesting as well. The Venezuelan government was totally discontent with it. They weren't aware that this unit existed whatsoever. They summoned the UK Chargé d'Affaires, Duncan Hill, to explain the UK government's position on this. Similarly, Richard Bergen asked a question in Parliament about this, and thirdly, the question was asked by the Venezuelan government to the UK government at the United Nations. Now, in all three of their answers, the British government suggested that this was a small unit. It was going to demobilise soon anyway. It had one permanent member of staff, and it had 3 part-time members of staff. And I don't want to outscoot myself at this point, but recently revealed documents suggest that the Tories have lied to Parliament about this. The unit looks much bigger than they'd suggested. Secondly, it looks like the British government has lied to the UN about this by repeating the same lie. So yeah, we've got a situation where the British government appears not only to have been planning the reconstruction of a sovereign nation, but also that it's lied to the UN, it's lied to Parliament, and it's lied to the Venezuelan government about the actual size and scale and contents of this operation. And of course, the Venezuelan government as well put a few cracks in this narrative that the UK government tried to spin. So when John Saville visited Venezuela in 2019, he had to apply to the British Embassy to be able to travel because, ironically, the British government still recognised the ambassadorial duties of the government of Nicolas Maduro because Guaidó, had no effective power to issue visas to fulfil any of the normal ambassadorial responsibilities. And when Saville requested a visa via this embassy in London to visit Venezuela, there was no mention whatsoever of the Venezuela reconstruction unit. It simply said he was going on basic ambassadorial duties. So it seems like the British government has been caught in quite a major lie in response to being caught in quite a major scandal. But this isn't the only kind of form that the UK government is involved in Venezuela. As well as the Venezuela Reconstruction Unit at Declassified UK, Matt Kennard, their head of investigations, and myself have shown how the British government has been sponsoring a number of kind of civil society organisations in Venezuela, all of which appear to be quite strongly against the Venezuelan government. Now, as Rachael mentioned when she was talking about the US efforts to destabilise the Chavez government, the US usually uses different kind of government-linked organisations such as the National Endowment for Democracy, USAID, the NRI, the Republican Institute, etc., etc. The UK is running seemingly similar operations via something called the Conflict Stability and Security Fund. Now, this is about a £2 billion operation that is funded through the UK Foreign Office. And what we found is that Britain seems to be the sole funder of an anti-corruption unit operating in Venezuela. Many of the people that are chiefly involved in it are supporters of Juan Guaidó. They've called for street protests. This operation is also being channeled through Transparency International's Venezuela Charter, which is called Transparencia Venezuela. Now, the head of, Transparency International is a very interesting case in and of itself. It's funded by a number of Western governments. Years ago, it was funded by Shell and a number of other international mining organisations. It functions, it has a consistent function to find corruption most prevalent in the targets of US and UK foreign policy. So in the case of Venezuela, it seems very likely that Transparency International is being used as an apparently neutral mediator of regime change. And this is quite interesting as well, because in response to a major corruption scandal about the Venezuelan opposition, whereby they'd been embezzling massive amounts of humanitarian aid that was designated to go to people suffering on the Venezuelan border, and members of Juan Guaidó's team had been embezzling it, had been using it for having parties and lavish hotels and fancy meals out while they were staying in Colombia. Now, who did the Venezuelan government contract in order to basically clean their name and wipe the slate clean over this scandal? Well, Transparency International was then used. They appeared to come in quite handy. They basically absolved all of the key actors of what they'd been accused of doing, even though the main people accusing them of doing so was actually Juan Guaidó's ambassador in Colombia, Humberto Calderón. So we've got a consistent case of the British government here using civil society organisations that are apparently neutral to create to destabilise the Maduro government. We've also seen in a separate case how the British government has been funding anti-government media organisations such as Efecto Cucuyo. Notably, the editor of Efecto Cucuyo, which is a major Venezuelan kind of opposition news organisation, spoke alongside Jeremy Hunt at their 2019 Media Freedom event. And another declassified UK article, this one was written by Molly Antigon Hall, showed how Conservative Party donors have a real vested interest in Guayana Esequibo, which is a contested territory between Venezuela and Guyana. So if Guyana managed to succeed in their claim over this territory, then there is major interest for British oil and gas organisations. And at the same time, Juan Guaidó's representative to the UK was secretly recorded, admitting that the Foreign Office pledged support to the Venezuelan opposition only if they dropped their claim to Guyana Esequibo. So you've got a number of British major British interests in the oil and mining industries, and that you can see them actually functioning on behalf of them. Now, the final thing that I wanted to talk about with regards to British involvement in Venezuela over the past couple of years is the issue of sanctions. And I think this is one of the most important issues. I mean, the Department for International Development has, it continues boasting that it's given £44.5 million towards humanitarian aid. It won't, via 2 Freedom of Information requests, it won't tell us who this aid is going to, whether it's aligned with the opposition, whether there's political allegiances involved. They won't say who it's going to, so we can't actually check if this is indeed humanitarian aid or going towards civil society organisations again. However, it keeps bragging that it's given this 44.5 million. However, at the same time, and once again under US pressure, the British government pressured the Bank of England to freeze roughly $2 billion worth of Venezuelan gold. In the Times, Jeremy Hunt admitted, according to former NSA chief John Bolton, that he was delighted to pressure the Bank of England to freeze this amount of gold. And in the Times since, the UN Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive sanctions or measures on human rights has explicitly instructed the British government to release this gold so that the Venezuelan government can respond to the COVID emergency. She explicitly said that freezing funds, both as large as this, are directly impeding the Venezuelan government from responding both to the coronavirus crisis, but from also importing food and medicine. There's about 90,000 people that are lacking HIV medicine. A lot of people are totally incapable of. Well, a lot of the Venezuelan government is incapable of importing a lot of really necessary medicine at the moment. So, you've got a situation here where the UN is explicitly asking the British government not to starve or not to allow die what could be in the numbers of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans. And the British government, of course, totally ignored this. So, there's kind of a hybrid war going on at the moment against Venezuela. Of course, the US is the main culprit. However, the British government is much more involved than any of the mainstream media has allowed people to understand or to know about. It's not just sanctions. There's secret efforts within the Foreign Office, and a lot of it, as declassified as the Canary and a small number of other outlets have shown, is involved with oil and mining interests.
Thanks so much, John. And as you say, the media, doesn't really report on any of this. I know at the time you mentioned that media conference that Jeremy Hunt was addressing with one of the editors of Kokuya, that media platform that the British government was kind of funding and helped fund. And less than an hour away, Julian Assange had been imprisoned and are now facing 2 years in Belmarsh prison for exposing war crimes of the US government, of which the UK and the British government is holding $2 billion worth of Venezuelan gold, and spending all this money when in a time when food banks are record levels, where child poverty in the UK. And I think it's really important that the media, that your work at the Canary, that the independent media is kind of exposing this, because I think it's an essential for democracy that these kind of actions that are done in our name with our taxes, and that our governments are choosing to spend our taxes on overthrowing other governments instead of feeding children. I think the British people have a right to know that. So one of the comments that's come in on, we've had a number of comments. One I very much agree with. John Halloway on Telesort English Facebook says, "A great intro, thank you, Rachel." That was a very a brilliant 10-minute intro to 20 years of Venezuelan history, pretty much. Then we've got Kevin Hattie on YouTube saying, "The uniform coverage of this in the mainstream media is laughable. How many people know about these scandals? A true failure of responsibility on the part of journalists." Well done, John. He has a question. I think we could maybe just go into this question. We are getting questions in different platforms are trying to keep up with as many of them as possible. He asked something, a question around the elections that are coming up in Ecuador and in Brazil next year. And he says, how important are these for Venezuela to have leftist victories in Ecuador and Brazil? And maybe after Rachel, I'm sure, has questions for John as well. But it would be good to touch on the issue of the media coverage of all of this and why the mainstream media hasn't kind of done the work that you've done.
Yes, to begin with the mainstream media. I mean, what you find when you're reporting about Latin America in general is the media is often content to report about this scandal or that scandal, but the last thing that you find the media ever reporting about is its home country's responsibility or involvement in those scandals. I think quite a clear case of that was recently when, as I was speaking about, Alina Duhan, the UN Special Rapporteur's report on the impacts of sanctions in Venezuela. I mean, of course, it asked or requested or advised that the UK government unfreeze Venezuelans' gold. But there are a number of other shocking scandals in it as well. It said that Venezuela's income had decreased by 99% since the beginning of sanctions. It said that a number of Venezuelan children could not access adequate medical treatment in Venezuela because they couldn't import the necessary medication for bone marrow transplants. So they had to be flown to European countries like Italy. I mean, it wasn't a case that the Venezuelan government didn't have the money. It was literally impossible for them to treat these children in the country because of the nature of the sanctions that had been placed on Venezuela by the US, the European Union, and Britain, of course. So this was a UN Special Rapporteur saying that the British and the American governments and a number of others were complicit in war crimes, and the war crime would be under the Geneva Convention of 1949, that they were holding Venezuelan citizens collectively responsible for the apparent actions of its government. And I mean, what happened? I don't think anybody reported. I mean, the Canary, Venezuela Analysis, and the Grey Zone Project were some of the main independent media to report on it. Outside of that, virtually nobody did. I mean, CNN wrote a tiny report on it. Reuters, I think, mentioned it, but neither the New York Times, the Guardian, the BBC, any of these major supposedly liberal outlets reported on this whatsoever, which I thought was frankly shocking. Not only because they had reported on a number of former UN reports. If you take Michelle Bachelet's report from the summer of 2019, they reported, an array of human rights abuses in Venezuela. That they were quite damning for the Venezuelan government, and of course they reported on figures of child poverty that also reflected incredibly badly on the Venezuelan government. But at no time, when these UN special rapporteurs actually involve our own governments in this process, do the liberal media bother to report on it? So you've got this situation where the Western media reports on human rights abuses or poverty in Venezuela, which is largely caused by the impact of sanctions. And in not mentioning sanctions whatsoever, it adds to the narrative that the Venezuelan government is totally inept and evil, and therefore creates the justification for putting on even more sanctions. So I think it's really quite a cynical situation that we're in with the media at the moment with regards to Venezuela. I don't know if you wanted me to continue with Kevin Hattie's question or.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's maybe that would. I think if you give us an answer for that, and then Rachel, I'm sure will have some questions for you as well.
Yeah, sure. I'll just respond briefly to Kevin's question, which just to go back, how important is it for Venezuela to have leftist victories in Ecuador this year and in Brazil next year in the respective elections? It's massively important. Chavez's election in 1999, it was the start of the pink tide in Latin America. And he said in his own words that he felt consistently isolated all international fora until Lula in Brazil was elected. And then he felt like he had an actual true ally. And then throughout the following decade, you had victories for Morales in Bolivia, for Korea and Ecuador, for de Kirchner in Argentina, and a number of other Latin American countries. And what this is also quite important as well, because we, once again, to go back to the sanctions, but also in terms of diplomatic pressure. I mean, Maduro at the moment in Latin America is quite massively isolated. If you take the Lima group, for example, which was basically created to exact regime change in Venezuela, it covers a number of countries that are literally bordering on Venezuela. So at the moment, Venezuela doesn't really have much support, but it would also allow like the return of certain forms of regional solidarity. Rachael mentioned them at the beginning, but organizations like UNASUR and ALBA, even Petrocaribe, where Venezuela was exporting oil at zero interest rates to countries like Haiti, which is seeing massive uprisings at the moment, and they're trying to get rid of their corrupt president, who's also backed by the US. So yeah, I mean, I think it'd be really important to see a victory in Ecuador. It would be massively important for Brazilians as well to see a victory. Well, to see Bolsonaro finally defeated in Brazil. They've got the second largest case rate of coronavirus deaths at the moment as well. So I think, yeah, for the region, it's incredibly important. For Venezuela also.
Yeah, thanks, John. I want to say that this is really kind of amazing work that you're doing, really, because and work really that's not been done to my knowledge before. When I was living in Venezuela, there were a lot of revelations about US funding, but not so much in terms of Britain's role. So all this is really there's not been a light shone on it up until, as far as I know, your work. So it's really, really interesting, also scandalous, like Pablo's saying, that this has all been, being done with taxpayers' money. It's also interesting for me to see how there are parallels there, like you were saying, some of the same things that were being done with USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy, working through Venezuelan NGOs. It's actually illegal in Venezuela to fund political parties externally, and obviously a way around this is to start funding NGOs. But when you looked closer, a lot of these NGOs were extremely politicized and allied with the opposition, and receiving all kinds of training in ways to kind of, subvert the government. So it's interesting to see those parallels there and to see what you've started to unearth, really. Just to stick with the kind of regional perspective of Kevin's question, is this kind of like a lone policy of the UK government, or, is kind of British imperialism or its tentacles kind of operating anywhere else in the region that you know of? Because we like you've been saying, Maduro's been quite isolated recently. In the past few years, we've seen kind of the pink tides kind of dissipated. Obviously, there's the Lima group that have been leading the charge against Venezuela. That's possibly going to start to change now. So are there any efforts, by the UK government to kind of subvert other, countries in the Latin American region?
It's a really good question, and I mean it's an area of interest that is certainly rising at the moment. There wasn't so much before. I mean, Britain was the foremost economic and mostly political power in Latin America throughout much of the 19th century. But since the end of the Second World War, it's generally assumed that British interests in Latin America altogether subsided, and that with that fall of economic interest, then there was very little political interest to get involved in to topple democracies or etc., as we're seeing in Venezuela at the moment. But I mean, during the Cold War period, there were a number of instances that we've been working on at Brazil Wire and a number of different outlets, how Britain was actually intervening in the internal political affairs of other countries. They were, funding and trying to influence journalists in Brazil who were critical of the coup regime between 1964 and 1985. I recently revealed in Declassified UK that the British government, it wasn't just the US government that had a keen interest in toppling Salvador Allende, in Chile in 1973, but a secret Foreign Office unit called the Information Research Department, which was basically involved in distributing propaganda, had been trying to, destabilize Allende's election campaigns throughout all of the 60s. That it cooperated with a CIA-linked outfit called World Foreign Features in the run-up to the 1973 coup. So the British government was involved throughout the Cold War, but I mean, also more recently, we found at Brazil Wire that the British government, the Foreign Office, had been holding secret meetings with the Bolsonaro campaign. The British ambassador to Brazil, Vijay Rangarajan, had been secretly lobbying Bolsonaro before he was elected. And of course, Bolsonaro is a neo-fascist. He's horrifically homophobic, racist. I mean, he's been one of the most dangerous, probably the most dangerous president for Brazil in non-dictate in the space of a democracy. Also, Colombia, Britain was since 1989. Up until around at least 2016, Britain was fighting a supposed war on drugs in Colombia. However, what coincided with Britain's war on drugs in Colombia, which entailed, arming the Colombian military, providing assistance, in psychology, training the Colombian police as well. So, parallel to all of this, Britain had major interests in the Colombian oil industry. British Petroleum at the turn of the century, in 2000. Was the largest foreign direct investor in Colombia. And this was at the same time as the Colombian military was murdering trade unionists at a greater rate than the rest of the world combined. And much more recently, just, I believe, last month, Matt Kennard at Declassified UK revealed how the British government had a major interest in the coup in Bolivia against Evo Morales, that Britain is extremely interested in what they call the white gold, which is the lithium that's used in mobile phone batteries and etc. And the British Embassy as well was collaborating with the organisations that created the false narrative that there was electoral fraud. So there's numerous cases since the end of the Second World War, and especially more recently, about British involvement in Latin America and British malign involvement in Latin America, which involves influencing journalists, intervening in democracies, propaganda, etc. So yeah.
Wow, that's thanks for such a comprehensive answer. That's quite a lot, to take in. But yeah, it's just incredible. I guess my question for you is, this is something that you're doing, Matt Kennard's doing, but I think the amount of journalists working on this, you could count on one hand quite easily. How, and I imagine that the UK has not been forthcoming in terms of talking about this. So my question is kind of, how difficult has it been for you as a journalist to report on something so delicate and sensitive as this, in terms of exposing what you've rightfully said are war crimes by our government? It's it's really serious. So how have you found it in terms of reporting on something this sensitive?
Well, I mean, with the British government, one of the main barriers to reporting on it is the total lack of transparency of what the British government is doing abroad. I mean, freedom of information requests. I mean, you get email, documents back showing it's, let's say, for example, email discussions between Vanessa Neumann and Foreign Office officials, and it's not just certain segments of it are redacted. You get pages and pages and pages of redactions, and that's talking about the Freedom of Information Act. If you're doing research in the archives, in the British National Archives, like I did for my work on Chile, which showed they were involved in the coup against Salvador Allende, the documents that were coming out, these were from 1962, 1964, some of them as late as 1970. However, that's over 50 years after the fact. I mean, the rule is supposed to be after 25 years that they're supposed to redact these documents. However, there's a major operation behind the scenes whereby under the terms of national security, which what it really means is to avoid national embarrassment, you have a number of ex-security services officials basically deciding what should be declassified and what shouldn't be declassified. So I think the major barrier for me, I think, when reporting about what Britain is up to abroad, is definitely the total lack of transparency. But I suppose a second issue is, I mean, you report a story, so let's say like the Venezuela reconstruction unit story. It causes something of a diplomatic crisis between Venezuela and the UK. It receives, national attention across all of Latin America. I mean, it was in print in Germany and whatever. But there was radio silence in the UK. Total radio silence. I mean, the corporate media is totally uninterested in, especially malign actions of the British state abroad. So that's another issue. I mean, it's even if you do manage to find information that's within the public interest, the people that are supposed to be sharing that are not interested in sharing it. So there's a massive disparity between what is perceived as important and what is actually, in my opinion at least, important. And that's what our government's up to abroad. Yeah,
no, absolutely. I must imagine it's quite difficult to piece together the different, the different elements of it all, because like you said, when documents come back, you might just get a snippet of something and a snippet of something else, and then trying to, piece together all that is quite difficult. In terms of kind of these conversations you mentioned between Vanessa Newman, who is, Guaido's ambassador to the UK, official ambassador, what could you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, I know a lot of it was redacted, but is there any significance there? Can we infer from that?
Yeah, I mean, Vanessa Neumann's certainly an interesting character. I mean, she resigned, I believe, about 4 months ago. Once it was incredibly clear that Guaido is a lost bet. Her and a number of others decided to resign. She was quite frank about it in a resignation. Actually, she basically said that she doesn't think he's the apt person to lead the Venezuelan opposition anymore, which it's incredible she ever thought she was, given only 20% of Venezuelans knew who he was when he declared himself president. But nonetheless, to talk a little bit about who she is, because I think it's quite important to, I suppose, discuss who Guaido's kind of chief lobbyists in various countries were. Of course, there was a lot of work on Carlos Vecchio in the US, who was a former Exxon. He formerly worked for Exxon, the massive oil organization. And I mean, Vanessa Neumann is quite similar. She used to be an oil lobbyist. Ben Norton, who writes for The Grey Zone, described her as cartoonishly elite. She comes from the Venezuelan oligarchy. I believe her granddad, Hans Neumann, was the owner of a major company in Venezuela. He then became the major shareholder in a company called Mustique Holdings. Now Mustique, that meant that he was the majority shareholder of a tropical island, where Vanessa Neumann then went to live, I believe, with her former husband, Mick Jagger. But I mean, on the political, so I mean, you get the kind of idea of a socio-economic background. Extremely establishment. Went to prestige schools in the US. Is not representative of the average Venezuelan whatsoever. I mean, she only lived the first decade of her life in the country anyway. However, on the political front, I mean, she's been one of the foremost people calling for a coup. I mean, she told former CIA director Mike Pompeo at an Aspen Security Conference that the people are affected, something to the effect of the people are asking for liberation. Please, when are you going to save us? She said the same. She went, we want Britain to help liberate us from tyranny. You could say there is a wonderful post-Brexit opportunity for Britain. And she's one of the key people pushing the narrative that Maduro is some transnational drug trafficker. At the same time as she was, she worked with demobilized Colombian paramilitary. So there's this total disconnect between, reality and what's going on. And of course, I don't believe there's much intention to actually reflect reality whatsoever. She's very much aware, as a former oil lobbyist, that there's major interests in Venezuela that she can unlock for her friends. And I mean, to go into I mean, last year she threatened myself and a number of other journalists, saying, well, it was written on her corporate Twitter account, so she has a minor bit of plausible deniability about it. But she shared a tweet saying "Death to Maduro." I shared it, and a number of other people shared it. Then, from a corporate Twitter account, the next morning there was this absurd claim that we were part of a transnational criminal network with a price on your head. Which is quite a serious thing to say, but at the same time, that from her, it's simply laughable. So yeah, I mean, she's a very interesting and colourful character. She's from the Venezuelan elite. She pretends that she's representative of the ordinary Venezuelan, but her background suggests that she's simply interested in reaping profits from a coup.
Yeah, I mean, you say she's laughable, but it sounds like, our government has been, taking it very seriously. She's been kind of leading negotiations between Guaidó and the British government. So, we might find her laughable in a way, and, she certainly is, but it's pretty unbelievable that, she's been that kind of connected to the UK government, really. I don't know if we have to start wrapping up now, because it's 7:27, so it looks like we've got a few minutes remaining. 5 minutes remaining, I'm being told. So, John, if I could get your thoughts on, just before we finish up, is there anything we can do to kind of hold our government and the and our press, really, the liberal press, to account? What can we be doing to kind of force this into the public narrative? Obviously sharing your articles and following the Canary as much as possible, but is there anything else that we can be doing?
Well, I think some of the main things at the moment are really just making sure that enough people are, cognizant of what the British government is actually up to with regards to Venezuela at the moment. And I think the most serious instance of that is sharing Alina Duhan's preliminary report on sanctions in Venezuela, because she makes it resolutely clear that the sanctions, the gold frozen in the Bank of England at the moment is totally unacceptable. That she suggested it amounts to a war crime, but I don't think in general that this kind of message is going to come out via the corporate media. They don't think of themselves responsible for changing any of these things. So the main thing is both to support independent media like the Canary, like Declassified UK, like the Grey Zone, like a number of others. And also there are a number of protests that were held outside the Bank of England in 2019, also in 2020. So I'd say follow groups like Venezuela Solidarity Committee, because then you can find out when you can actually put on some, direct pressure on the government. I think you're muted, Pablo.
I think you're on mute, Pablo.
Apologies. Just thanking John for a fascinating talk, telling us about his massively important work exposing what the British government is doing in Venezuela, but also showing us that it's not just in Venezuela where it's up to no good, and showing how there are historical roots to the British government subverting and trying to overthrow democracies in Latin America. Thanks to Rachael for her really great intro to the context that we needed to understand this much better. And I think it's become clear, that the mainstream media, there's been an effective dereliction of duty by journalists on the issues around reporting these progressive governments and reporting the crimes of our allies. I mean, we haven't even gone into really what happens in in Colombia. And I think, as someone, Rachael and I went in 2019, another documentary that you can watch on YouTube called The Fight for Peace, where we we visited, some of the victims of the kind of massacres that have taken place by governments funded to the tune of billions by the US and supported by the British government. So the crimes of our allies are whitewashed, and the alleged crimes of our enemies are kind of make front page news. So this is something that, as citizens, as we need to demand that our journalists report, that do their job, show us what our governments are doing in our name. And so I tip my hat to you, the virtual hat to you, John, for your work. May you continue doing this work. Urge people again to support independent media, the Canary. If you want to know more about the region, Latin America, you can visit alborada.net, the events we do, the articles. If you want to know specifically about Venezuela, that there's no better place to go than Venezuelanalysis.com. So yeah, stay in touch with these websites, and follow the story. As I think, as British citizens, we have a duty to call our government to account. And thanks, John, for the massively important work you do. So thanks to everyone who tuned in. Sorry we couldn't get to all the questions on the various platforms, but I would urge you, if you enjoyed the show, to share it with your contacts and to sign up to the Canary's e-newsletter so you can hear about other Canary Lives. So once again, thanks, John. Thanks, Rachel. And see you hopefully again.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.